Thank you everybody for being here. Welcome to the Legacy Learning Series, an online monthly learning series with Legacy Pardes faculty members in honor of Pardes' 50th anniversary. Today we have the honor of learning with Leah Rosenthal. Leah holds a BA in Talmud and Jewish philosophy and an MA in Jewish education, both from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She's been teaching Talmud at Pardes for over 30 years and still enjoys doing so. She combines her teaching at Pardes with teaching at the nearby Pelech High School for Girls. On a personal note, I fell in love with learning Talmud from Leah, and perhaps some of you have had that experience as well. So thank you, Leah, for your over 30 years of teaching at Pardes. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Jordan. It is wonderful to see many familiar faces, some new faces on the screen, and thank you all of you together. Thank you for joining us this evening. Well, for me, it's this evening. I don't know where you are on the face of the planet. And I will say a word about Zoom. I mean, Zoom is an amazing technology. This couldn't have happened without Zoom, obviously, but it does have its restrictions, it does have its limitations, and one of them is I'm going to suggest that although I by far prefer a very interactive discussion, I think Zoom is challenging. So I'm going to ask people if you have observations, questions, thoughts, things that you'd like to share, to jot them down so you don't forget them. And towards the end of session today, we'll leave a couple of minutes for people to share some of their thoughts and ideas and etc. I think it'll be much more efficient than trying to combine it as we go along. So assuming people have a source sheet in front of them, they were sent out, and also I think you see Jordan just posted on the chat, so it's possible to access the source sheet. I will not be screen sharing any of the sources. I much prefer seeing as much as possible people on the screen, at least maintaining some kind of feeling of eye contact. So please have your source sheets available if you've in any way that you prefer, and let's just get started. So many of our classic Talmudic narratives are highly, Jordan, there's been a request to post. Yeah, we're good. Thank you. Many of our classic Talmudic narratives are highly dramatic, right? They present they present the individuals that are participating in these narratives often in proportions that are larger than life. Things happen. Many of you have had, I'm sure, experience and exposure to some of these dramas, right? These classic narratives, these epic battles, miraculous, that includes miraculous and supernatural events. All kinds of things happen, right? Fiery gazes, if we're already speaking on Lag BaOmer, right? We have fiery gazes, angelic appearances, walls that can be uprooted from their, teetering between falling, collapsing, and standing upright, trees that can be uprooted and fly towards the heavens, drama and drama and drama and drama. The story that we're going to be reading together today is very different. It's a very quiet story. It takes place it's very inwardly directed. Most of the events narrated in the story take place in the thoughts and heart and soul of the protagonist of the story. Very little actually of that drama is present in this particular story. And the primary personality that we're going to be looking at closely in this class is also going to emerge as a very different type of personality type. He too will become evident. He too feels like a quiet personality, almost, I'd want to say, unassuming, maybe even shy, introverted, right? A different kind of personality than some of the rabbinic portraits that we're used to seeing hanging on the walls of our rabbinic portrait gallery. And as such, I'm very intrigued by this particular individual, and most emphatically this particular story about this particular individual. So I'm going to invite you to come along with me to get a bit more of a acquaintance, to make the acquaintance of a very central rabbinic figure, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, who fills the pages of both the Babylonian Talmud and the Talmud Yerushalmi. His teachings are everywhere. When you come across the name Rabbi Elazar with no added qualifier, it's this Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat. Provided one provision I will going to make, provided you're talking about the Amoraitic level, right? There are Tanaim by the name of Rabbi Elazar, and there are Tanaim by the name of Rabbi Elazar. We're not speaking about those, the name when it appears in Tanaitic literature, but when the name Rabbi Elazar appears in Talmudic literature, in Amoraitic and the Amoraitic layer, it is a reference to this Rabbi Elazar, and his teachings are everywhere. So he's a very dominant character in terms of the mark that he's left on rabbinic literature, but the personality that emerges in the narratives that we're going to see, again, I think present a very different type of figure than some of the figures that we're used to seeing. So the primary text that we're going to be reading today is a story that appears in Masechet Ta'anit. It's source number 1 on your source sheets. I've brought it both in the original and in an English translation. We'll primarily be reading from the English, but you can glance over at the original, Hebrew/Aramaic original, and on occasion I'll draw your attention to the way it's formulated, again, in the original narrative. Masechet Ta'anit is a treasure trove of Talmudic narrative, right? There's so many stories, so many narratives that are included in that Masechet, and this is tucked away, easy to miss, okay? Almost easy to miss, but it's there, and I want to draw our attention and pause at this story and spend a little bit of time both unpacking the story, but also unpacking the character of Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat. And by doing so, I think I'm also taking my cues from Rashi. If you can see, the story begins with the presentation of its main protagonist, right? The story in source number 1, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, Dechika le milta tuva, okay? Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat found himself in very great want. If we were studying this story from the traditional volumes of the Talmud, I would immediately direct your attention to Rashi. But because I knew we weren't going to be studying from the page of Rashi, I included Rashi on our sheet, and I want to pause for a moment, even before we continue reading the story, even begin reading the story, at what to me is a very striking moment in terms of Rashi's choices in his commentary to the Talmud. So in source number 2, if you go to the second page, on source number 2, I've brought you Rashi's commentary. And as the story begins in Masechet Ta'anit, Rashi does something that is not his usual practice. He stops everything and he gives us a 2-line bio of Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat. Almost as if he's telling us you can't continue reading, you can't even begin reading the story until you know several biographical facts about Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, without which you won't understand the story. In that sense, I have a high sense of gratification here, because I personally, and some of you on screen here know that, I am a very deeply convinced that that's true in general. If you don't know who the individual rabbinic figures, certainly in literary narratives, but I think also in halachic discourse, are not interchangeable. When a particular rabbi makes an appearance on a page of Gemara, you need to know, or you want to know something about who he is. And Rashi here stops everything and says, let me tell you a few facts about Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, without which you will not be able to understand this story, or at least fully appreciate the story. And let's read Rashi together. I don't have an English translation for Rashi, but it's short, we can translate together. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, Amora Hava, All right, first thing Rashi says, he's an Amora. He belongs to the Amoraitic period, right? After the publication of the Mishnah and the creation of the Mishnah, in that second very central Talmudic period known as the Amoraitic period, the Amoraim. So he was an Amora. Vehu hanikra Mara de'ara de'eretz Yisrael b'masechet nida. Okay, Rashi says, this particular rabbinic figure, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, is referred to in the Gemara in Masechet Nida as Mara de'ara de'eretz Yisrael, as the master of the land of Israel, okay? The authoritative master of teaching of Torah in the land of Israel. Another little piece of biographical information that Rashi thinks we should know before we start the story. Ba'al horaot haya. Okay, Ba'al Horaot, he was also a master of teaching, which I think has multiple meanings. It also indicates, or it also seems to make a reference to the fact that his teachings, as certainly as Rashi knows, and as I mentioned before, his teachings are extant throughout rabbinic literature. He was a Ba'al Horaot. He taught many teachings, transmitted many traditions. But Ba'al Horaot also has another meaning to it, or a secondary meaning to it, and that is it emphasizes that he also would issue halachic rulings, okay? Ba'al Hora'ah is someone who instructs practical halachic decision-making and issues that to the community. So that too, Rashi thinks, is important for us to know. Vehu shimesh Rabbi Yochanan acharei mot Reish Lakish. After the death of Reish Lakish, some of you might recall, again, one of those classic narratives, very dramatic narratives of the Talmud Bavli. After the death of Reish Lakish, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat replaces Reish Lakish as Rabbi Yochanan's chevruta. He served Hushimesh at Rabbi Yochanan. He became his colleague, his companion, perhaps, his chevruta for sure. And that's narrated that Rashi is also picking up that piece of biographical information for us and conveying that to us before we start our story about Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat in Masechet Ta'anit. The Hushimesh Rabbi Yochanan acharei mot Reish Lakish v'haya dachuk ve'ani. And he was poor, he suffered from poverty, and dachuk, dachak, is dachak literally is pressure, okay? He lived a very difficult life, okay? He had a difficult life. The implication is, and Rashi's lifting this as well from narratives elsewhere in the Talmud, he suffered from ill health, as we'll soon see in our story as well. He suffered from poverty. He apparently suffered also personal losses. It seems suggested in some of the narratives that we won't be looking at together now that he lost some of his children to a premature early death. A life of suffering and certainly not ease and comfort. Okay? So Rashi points out basically 5 facts about Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat that he thinks we need to know before we start the story. And I'm going to take my cues from Rashi, and in spite of the fact that we don't have all that much time, I'm going to try and also extend a little bit or expand a little bit some other narratives, just collect them from different places in both the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi, to get a little bit more of a sense of this person, of who he was, and the kind of information that Rashi had access to that moved him to give us that capsule biography, just the tip, just the points, just the facts, but just to get a little bit, flesh them out a little bit more with a collection of just 3 brief narratives that are not our central text for today, but enough to give us a little bit more of a context and of a background of who is Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, what do we know about him, what else can we know about him, even beyond what Rashi summarized for us so concisely, suggesting that it was important for the understanding of the story. So the first text I want to look at in that context is text number 3, where we're going back to text number 1 very soon. But text number 3 is a brief little concise text that I'd like to look at and glean from it some additional information or insight into the personality and life story of Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat. So we read the following in the Gemara in Ketubot, towards the end of Masechet Ketubot, the Gemara, the Talmud Bavli tells us the following. When Rabbi Elazar went up to the land of Israel, Rabbi Elazar ki hava salik Eretz Yisrael, when he went up to the land of Israel, he remarked, I have escaped one. When he was ordained, he said, I have escaped two. When he was given a seat on the council for intercalation, he exclaimed, I have escaped the three. For it is said in scripture, and my hand shall be against the prophets that see vanity. Okay, a verse from Yechezkel. V'haita yadi el hanevi'im hachozim shav, v'hakosmim kazav. Okay, those prophets who were prophesying in vain. Okay, were prophesying untruths. My hand shall be against them. And the pasuk continues, they shall not be in the council of my people. This refers to the council of intercalation. Neither shall they be written in the register of the house of Israel, refers to ordination. Neither shall they enter into the land of Israel is to be understood literally. Now, this passage, okay, describes Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat at critical moments of his life, where he's sort of doing this countdown, right? He's saying when he successfully goes from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, which, by the way, we can open a parenthesis now for a moment and add to the information that we have from Rashi, the fact that he was known as Mara Da'ara de Eretz Yisrael. Clearly, most of his active rabbinic life was in Eretz Yisrael. He becomes known as the master of Eretz Yisrael. He originates from Bavel. Right? He is an original Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, like several other rabbis of his generation, left Bavel and came to Eretz Yisrael in order to begin or establish their activities in the rabbinic world in Eretz Yisrael. But when he successfully, navigated that move from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, he counts down one. When he was ordained, received his smicha in Eretz Yisrael, he counts down two. That's two, he says, okay? And when he was asked to join the council that calculates the Ibur Hashanah, right? That calculates the secret, right? In the original, it says Sod HaIbur. When he was asked to join the council that is privy to the secrets of defining the Jewish calendar, when a year would become a leap year, then he said to himself, I have now can count down the three. And the reference, as the text itself says, is to this interesting interpretation of that verse. Against false prophets, where God says, my hand shall be against those prophets who prophesy falsely. They will not come to Eretz Yisrael. They will not be ordained. They will not. So besides some additional biographical data that we can pick up from this narrative, we know he came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. We know he was ordained. We know he was asked to join one of the most exclusive, right, gatherings of rabbinic authority, those that are part of the decision-making process. We know all of that from this text, but perhaps we also learn something about his personality. What do we learn about his personality? The fact that he's counting down, okay? He's saying, okay, I can check this one off my list. I can check this one off my list. What do we learn about him? If we go back to the original text of the pasuk, right? He is worried. He is he's occupied with his self-examination. Am I possibly a false prophet? Can I reassure myself that what I'm doing is actually true? So once I manage to get to Eretz, I can say to myself, okay, this isn't happening to me. I am not being prevented from coming to Eretz Yisrael. I'm not being prevented from. So every achievement, right, that he achieves, right, instead of patting himself on the back and saying, look how wonderful I am, he's saying, what a relief, all right? What a relief. I can now say to myself, finally, I can reassure myself, I'm not a false prophet. I am not representing those that seek God falsely. There's a glimpse here into a personality trait that I just want to put out there that we will see, I think, more of or factor in as we start this story that we're going to be primarily focusing on. The second short text that I'd like to look at is a text from the Yerushalmi. As I said before, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat appears extensively both in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. This is a very favorite narrative of mine for various reasons. Let's very hopefully quickly look through this. Rabbi Yochanan was walking. Rabbi Yochanan, right? The great Rabbi Yochanan, the larger than life Rabbi Yochanan. He was once walking, supported by Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, one of his students, and Rabbi Elazar saw him from a distance and hid from him. All right. Rabbi Yochanan saw from a distance Rabbi Elazar coming along, and then he saw him quickly cross the street and take a dodge away so that he shouldn't meet up with Rabbi Yochanan. He said, Rabbi Yochanan says, 2 things this Babylonian has done to me. 1, he does not greet me. And 1, he does not quote my teachings in my name. All right. This is an opportunity for Rabbi Yochanan to express some dissatisfaction with Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat. First of all, look what happens. He's avoiding me. He doesn't want to speak to me. He doesn't want to greet me. What kind of behavior is that? Secondly, I know for a fact, it's been told to me that he teaches the things that I've taught him. He teaches my traditions without attributing them to me. Right? Now, anybody who knows anything, I mean, it's certainly true of the rabbinic world. It's true of the academic world. When you don't cite your sources, right? When you cite, there's nothing more infuriating than that. And Rabbi Yochanan is angry, and watch how he calls him. He refers to him as this Babylonian, right? Look at this Babylonian. I don't know how long Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat has already been in Eretz Yisrael, but he's still being referred to by the local rabbinic authorities as this Babylonian. Look what he does. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, the story continues on the next page. He said, Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi attempts to appease Rabbi Yochanan. And he says to him as follows. He says, so is their custom. The small do not greet the great. In accordance with the verse, youth saw me and hid themselves. So Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi is explaining that is just the Babylonian etiquette, right? Lower authorities do not greet those that are, the small do not greet the great. So he's attempting to appease Rabbi Yochanan basically by claiming there's a culture gap here. All right, you're annoyed, but what he's doing is exactly the most accepted practice in Bavel. As they were walking, they continue walking. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, they saw a Bet Midrash. And Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi says to Rabbi Yochanan, you see that Bet Midrash? This is where Rabbi Meir, generations before us, this is where Rabbi Meir used to sit and teach. And he would continuously quote teachings in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, but he never quoted teachings in the name of Rabbi Akiva. To which Rabbi Yochanan says, the entire world knows that Rabbi Meir is the student of Rabbi Akiva. When Rabbi Meir teaches and doesn't mention his source, everybody knows that he's teaching Rabbi Akiva's Torah. He doesn't have to say, Rabbi Akiva taught me this. When he teaches Rabbi Ishmael, he has to say it's Rabbi Ishmael. But when he doesn't say anyone, that's obviously it's Rabbi Akiva, because everybody knows that Rabbi Meir's teachings all come from the source of all of Rabbi Meir's Torah is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi says, the whole world knows that Rabbi Elazar is the student of Rabbi Yochanan. You just explained yourself why Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat is not in the habit of saying Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan said Rabbi Yochanan. Everybody knows that everything that Rabbi Elazar teaches is Rabbi Yochanan's. You yourself just gave the explanation. As they passed by the statue of the king, Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi said, shall we walk around it? Maybe we should skirt around it so we don't walk in its. And Rabbi Yochanan said, why should we grant it such respect? It's like, I don't want to walk in front of that I don't want to seem as though we're granting by walking in the presence of the king. Let's avoid it. Okay. That's not something, we don't want to be there. And so Rabbi Yochanan answers, he says, no, but by skirting around this statue, you're actually giving it such importance, right? You're saying this is so important to me that I don't want to walk in front of it. Lehefech, he says, Rabbi Yochanan, let's walk in front of it and put out its eyes, okay? Let's demonstrate how little we care for this king, how little respect we have. We'll walk right in front of it and not even give it any acknowledgement. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi says, how well Rabbi Elazar did to not pass by in front of you. That's exactly what Rabbi Elazar, walking in front of something is a demonstration of disrespect. It's a demonstration of something's lack of importance, right? As you yourself have just said, Rabbi Yochanan finally says, Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi knows how to bring peace, okay? You've somehow managed to appease my anger at Rabbi Elazar ben. Now this story, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat doesn't appear in the story. He doesn't act, I mean, he appears at the very, but here too, I think we could glean some insight into the experiences of Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, having transferred from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. He's the Babylonian, he's the outsider. He suffers perhaps also from misunderstandings because of cultural gaps. I mean, we don't have to explain too much about that. And he's dismissed almost. He's not. He's an outsider. He's a bit of an outsider, and I think also that dodging away, that not wanting to meet up with Rabbi Yochanan also perhaps reflects something about this unassuming, this shy, maybe even introverted personality that doesn't find exchange and interaction with people to be very easy. Source number 5, I think we can leave. I see our time is passing, and I want to get back to source number 5 is the well-known description of how Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat is assigned to replace Reish Lakish, the one that Rashi as well referred to. You can look at it later. It's a very well-known source, but also gives us, I think, again, a little bit of glimpse into Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat's reception here in Eretz Yisrael, his behavior, his personality traits, his stature, his knowledge, his learning, the great respect that all of that has, but also his difficulties in just in belonging, of being a part of. Okay. I would like to go back to our story. We haven't even started reading it. Now, all we did was pause for a minute, using Rashi's cues, but also I think in general methodologically sound methodology. Let's get some information about who this person is, and now let's read the story as told in Masechet Ta'anit. So the story begins with Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat being described as the chika le'milta tuva. He found himself in very great want. And apparently, as we'll soon see in the next line, that great want is both ill health and poverty. Once, after being bled, okay, which is of course a medical procedure that's very often referred to in the Talmud, in the ancient world, practically for almost every illness or for many illnesses, one of the responses were to bleed, okay, to let bloodletting, right, which was perceived as being a healthy or assisting in recovering from illness. So once after being bled, he had nothing to eat. Right? And we know from other sources in the Talmud that when you undergo this activity of bloodletting, one of the things you have to do is eat, and mostly eat meat, right? Eat protein. It appears in several places in the Talmud. But he had nothing to eat, all right? And here's his poverty kicking in. He took a clove of garlic. The only thing he could find was one clove of garlic and put it into his mouth. His heart became faint and he fell asleep. Okay, so there's a lot of happening in that sequence of events that also again highlights his condition, and that I don't know, he puts that clove of garlic in his mouth, and the English translation here is he falls asleep. The Hebrew, the original Aramaic, is nim, which does mean to fall asleep, but I think we'll soon see, this is more than a sleep, okay? It appears that he basically, it appears to be, I would probably translate this as he faints. He falls into a faint, okay? He sort of drifts into this loses consciousness, and there he is, as a result of being ill and poor and undernourished, and just putting that clove of garlic in his mouth, that's it. He's out. The rabbi's coming to see him at that precise moment, or at some point very soon after. The rabbis come to visit him, perhaps knowing that he's not well. And they saw that he was crying and smiling, and that a ray of light was radiating from his forehead. So they find Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat out cold, all right, lying, I don't know, on the floor, on the couch. You can provide whatever setting you want, but he's out. And they see that as he's in this slumber or in this state of unconsciousness, in this faint, they see his facial expressions shifting from smiling to crying, maybe both at the same time. He's crying and smiling, and there's this ray of light coming out of his forehead. So they wait, right? They wait until he revives, until he comes back into consciousness. When he awoke, they asked him, why did you cry and laugh, right? We're very intrigued by what we've seen. Can you tell us where you were? What was happening to you when you were in this slumber, in this state of lost consciousness, okay? Why were you laughing and crying? Now, if you're a careful reader, you'll of course notice that they don't ask him about the ray of light emanating from his forehead. They only ask about the laughing and the crying. Why that might be is up to the reader to speculate about. A simple response might be that maybe they assume that he might not have known that a ray of light was coming out of his forehead, but he certainly would have known, would have experienced the laughter and the crying. So maybe they only ask him about those. Perhaps there's other reasons that will also emerge as we continue the text. But they ask him, what was happening? Now, here I want to pause for a minute because we're all, I mean, certainly we moderns, postmoderns, I don't know how to refer to ourselves, understand that this is a very a powerful moment, right? Where someone wants to access to what was happening to you when you had sunk into this state of loss of consciousness. You were someplace, okay, in the deepest recesses of your mind and soul, and whatever it was that was happening to you there, whatever it was, you know, I want to understand what it was that happened to you that led you to cry to weep and laughter. It's a moment. It's like being, I guess, on the hypnotist's couch where you're hypnotized into revealing your deepest thoughts. And Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat actually does share, okay? And he tells them, he shares with them the experience that he's just had when he was in this state of some kind of unconscious, subconscious, whatever you want to, however you want to refer to it. And he tells them the following. He replied, the Holy One, blessed be he, was sitting by my side, and I asked him, how long will I suffer in this world? Right? I want to for a minute quickly glance at the original. Amar lehu, he said to them, Hava yativ imi hakadosh baruch hu. Ve'amar ilei, and I said to him, Ad matai etzta'er b'hai alma. Now I want to pause for a second, because there's a phrase here that I don't know how sensitive your ears are to it, but it shouts out with such volume. Haya yoshev imi hakadosh baruch hu. God was sitting with me. I can think through, help me out here if you have if you have other thoughts, but I can think through all of Tanakh. I mean, it's hard. I don't really have all of Tanakh in my head, but as far as I can recall, there is no other place in Tanakh and in rabbinic narratives, in rabbinic literature, where someone, wait a second, sorry, I just lost there we go. Where someone describes themselves as God sitting with them, right? People stand before God, you fall on your face before God, you prostrate yourself before God. Who describes themselves as being in a situation where Yativ HaKadosh Baruch Hu imi, God was sitting with me. Here we are, the two of us, okay, sitting together, me and God. So already here I want to say, who is this man who, when he recedes into the dark, the deepest recesses of his mind, he sits with God as a companion, or God sits with him as a companion. And he takes advantage of that intimacy. There's a lot of intimacy there. There's a lot of companionship there. And he takes advantage of that. And he says to God, how much longer will I suffer in this world? Now, that's a question that we've heard people ask before. But it's usually asked, into a vacuum, or it's asked to the heavens, or it's asked to. Here, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat is saying, I finally had the opportunity to sit with my God right? Where he's sitting by my side and I'm asking him, God, how much longer could this last? How much longer will this last? And God responds to him. And here's the response. All of this he's telling, okay, as he awakes from this experience, and he tells this to his companions, the rabbis. He replied, God replied to me, Elazar, my son, Elazar bni, Ken Elazar bri, my son. Would you wish that I should turn back the world to its very beginnings? Perhaps you might then be born at a more prosperous hour. So God feels his pain. I think it seems that way. And he calls him, he refers to him as Elazar, my son. Again, there's a lot of, I think, love and caring and intimacy and relationship there. And he says, I feel your pain, Elazar, my son. Here's what I can offer you. I can offer you the possibility of turning back the clock. Okay, let's wipe the slate clean. Let's wipe the board clean and go back to the beginnings. Maybe then things will work out differently for you. Maybe then you'll be born with a different, at a different time, at a different place, with a different life story. Maybe things will be better for you if we start all over again. Now, the suggestion that God offers him, and in a minute we're going to see whether Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat will accept this answer, will accept this offer. But it's important, I think, to stop for a minute and consider more carefully what God is offering, but also maybe more importantly, what he's not offering. I mean, many of us might have thought that if you're sitting intimately with God and you say to him, okay, how much longer this, I'm suffering, that God could respond in many ways, okay? He could offer, and if he's trying to offer a solution, if he's trying to offer something, okay, to relieve, if he's offering relief, you might think that he would pull out, if this was a different type of story, he would pull out a sack of gold coins and hand it over to Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat and say, here you go, here are the magic beans, okay, go plant them in your garden and see what happens, and your fortunes will immediately change. Or here's a magic potion, this will heal you of all your illnesses, this will make everything better. It's God, for heaven's sake, right? He could do that, and he doesn't. What he says to him is, what I can offer you is the possibility of starting all over again. And he doesn't offer that possibility of, let's change everything right now. Here's a magic potion, right? Here are the magic beans. It's, and in that sense here, there's an echo here. I just want to point this out very briefly, that there's an echo here of Masechet Ta'anit in general, that there are natural forces that are at work in the world, and at least from a certain point in history, God has chosen not to interfere in those natural processes, right? So God is not going to hand over a magic potion. He's not going to offer him a sack of gold coins. But what he does offer him is, he says, you know what? I love you so much. I care for you so much. I'm willing to trash the whole thing and start all over again. Maybe this time things will work out better for you. So there's a very subtle and delicate theology here about what God will do and what this God will not do. There's also a nuance here, or at least there's also an ambiguity here in terms of understanding the story about what God is actually offering. One is a more minimal reading and one is a more maximal reading. What world is it that God suggests, let's start from the beginning? It could be the personal world of Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, right? And he's saying to him, you know what? Let's start all over. Let's rewind the clock, and here you'll be born again. And maybe this time your luck will be slightly different, or your destiny will be different. But I just lost my train of thought because of the chats. Okay, that's one possibility. A more extreme reading of it is, in order for me to enable you to start again, I have to turn the whole world back, all right? Because everything's interconnected, and who you are and who you'll be born to, and your parents and their parents and their parents' parents, and history, and just, just the way the world is. Listen, we can start all over, but I'm willing to do it. If you want, my son Elazar, if you want, we can do that. We'll just swipe the slate clean and start all over again. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat's response to God's offer is, again, I wish I was a better actress in terms of intonating his response when he says, all this, and then only perhaps, all right? If you look at God, when God says, you know what, you want to start again, I'll wipe the slate clean, maybe, perhaps, Dilma, right? He says in the original, maybe this time it'll be better. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat says, maybe? That's what you're giving me? Right? I see that you're willing to wipe the slate. I mean, that's really impressive that you're willing to destroy the world, but on the maybe off chance that maybe this time around, but maybe it won't. I mean, that's obviously what's implied here. God is releasing control. He's not going to. So that's reassuring. That's what I'm supposed to. And you can hear, I think, in Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat's response, this kind of like astonishment or puzzlement. That's what you're giving me? That's the best you can do? Is this maybe things will work out next time around? And then he continues to speak, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, and I want to just point out that a literary device that is very, very much utilized by the Talmudic narrative is when a speaker speaks twice in succession, one after another, but it's separated as two different speeches, right? He said, and then he said, the same person said. Usually what that implies is that there's a moment of silence, at least a moment or a few moments of silence in between the two speeches. So after responding and saying, what, that, perhaps, there's a few moments of silence. It looks like Rabbi Elazar is, in any case, considering the offer that he's just been given. And then I asked him, right, the narrative says, which is longer, the life that I've already lived or that which I am yet to live, right? Which, of course, is a question that you can only ask God, or you could ask anybody, but only God has the answer, right? And God can answer that question. He wants to know, has he passed the halfway mark at least, okay? Does he have more to live ahead of him than he has already lived through? And when God responds to him, the one that you've already lived, in other words, he's saying you've already passed, what's left to live is less time than that which you've already lived. And that seems to clinch the deal for Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, calculating, his chances, calculating the gamble. He's gambling that he's already been halfway through. I mean, it could be great. It could be that I'll be born into a better situation, but it could also be that I'll be born into an as bad situation or maybe even worse situation. If I've already been through half of it, it's just not worth the risk. So he responds to God and he says, I then said to him, if so, I do not want it. Okay, thank you for your offer. I'll stick with what I have. I then said to him, okay, my response then to God is, if so, I do not want it. God's response, as a reward for refusing this, I will grant you in the next world 13 rivers of balsam oil, as clear as the Euphrates and the Tigris, which will give you great pleasure. 13 rivers of fragrant balsamic oil is what you will receive in the world to come as your reward. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat continues to report on this conversation, and he said, I asked him that and nothing more. That's what I'm getting. I mean, I'm suffering through this life terribly, and the promise that you're giving me is 13 rivers of balsam oil. With all due respect, you're God, okay? This is Olam Haba. I'm me. I mean, I would expect to receive something more gratifying than that. That and nothing more. God replies to him, and what shall I then give to your fellow men? Okay, what shall I then give to your fellows? If I give you more, well, I guess think also there's an ambiguity here. It can go in several directions. Either if I give you more, then that means I'll have to give everybody else more. Or if I give you more, what will I have left to give others? All right. In which case, that I think is supported by the next response, although I will say that there are versions of this story in which the next line doesn't appear, which then allows us to then interpret, I think, well, if I give you more, I'll have to give everybody more, and I don't. That's what I give. Okay, that's what people get. Why are you, what, I don't know where you were getting your expectations from, but that's where people get. But given the version that we have, I think it sounds a little bit more like God is saying, yeah, well, if I give you more, then I won't have enough to go around, and other people will not receive their due portion. In which case, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat then responds and he says, do I ask this of one who has nothing? What do you mean, if I give you more? I mean, you're God again. I think systematically throughout the story, what are we seeing? Okay, we are seeing this conversation where Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat is meeting a God that is not the God that he expected. He is adjusting, or he's called upon to adjust his perception of God. He's called upon to adjust his theological perception of God. God is not a genie in heaven who will grant you your wishes. If that's your theology, you're in the wrong place, right? You have to slowly begin to confront the fact that God is not this wish granter, and he's not the giver of reward. And that's not his role, or at least that's not his chosen role. That is not the way he's going to interact with you. And time and again, Rabbi Elazar has to say to himself, what? That's what I get. That's what's happening. That's what you can give me. That and nothing more. That and perhaps. And you can almost observe, I think we've been privy here in this story, in this narrative of Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat telling what happened to him when he sunk into that faint, that subconscious, that he was in this place where he was working out for himself, articulating to himself, for himself, who is God and who is he not? What does he what does he provide and what does he not provide? What he does provide, all right, if we ask ourselves or ask the story, so what does God provide? If it's not, he doesn't grant my wishes. He doesn't. I think actually I saw somebody quickly on the chat right now. I actually think that God is sympathetic. He provides. He sits with him. And again, that description of if Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat really experiences God as sitting by his side, I mean, that's a huge experience. That's a deep spiritual experience. I feel like God is sitting at my side and I can say to him, I can speak to him. And he doesn't give me the answers necessarily that I'm expecting or that I'm hoping for, or that I'm wishing for. And I'm slowly beginning to adjust my expectations or my desires or my wishes, but he's with me. He's with me. He responds. He loves me. He cares for me. He calls me his son. I feel that. I feel that he's even willing to destroy the world, but I don't want that. So he gives me companionship. He gives me love, right? He doesn't give me magical solutions to my problems. What I think in a minute, we'll read the last line of the story. But thinking back, I'm asking, all of this was in response to the rabbis asking him about his crying and laughing. And at no point is there any clear reference to what was he crying about and what was he laughing about. Is it that there's a moment in the story where he was laughing and then a moment those laughter turns into tears, or vice versa? Or was he continuously both laughing and crying as all of this was happening? But the laughter and the crying, the weeping is a very intensely emotional process that he's experiencing. Maybe we should read the last line. Getting to perhaps back to the ray of light that emanated from his forehead, because here too, his forehead is going to be, is going to appear. God, okay, at this point, he's still narrating. He snapped at my forehead. Okay, the description is like flicking with your fingers. The original here, it's on the second page, right? The original is some Greek term, askotla. It's a flicking with your fingernail, right? With the tip of your finger. He flicked my forehead. God, flicked my forehead. And he said to me, Elazar, my son, my arrows are upon you, my arrows. Girai bach. Ken Elazar bni girai bach. My arrows are upon you. And I think maybe perhaps that flicking, God's flicking at his forehead, might be linked to that ray of light emanating from his forehead. But what is this cryptic ending? What is God saying to him? And apparently it's with that message that he reemerges back into the real conscious world. Okay, it's at that moment that he awakes And with all of this, with all of this having happened to him, in him, etc. But what is that last message? The last message that God gives him as he's about to return to the world of the conscious. So he flicks his forehead, maybe perhaps slightly painfully, right? And he says, my arrows are upon you. Now, in traditional commentary, I've seen very often people interpret this as meaning that maybe perhaps suggesting in a theological context, which is not unfamiliar, that pain that you suffer in the world is it's what connects us. Okay, it creates this connection between us. It's my arrows that you suffer from, and maybe perhaps this theology of suffering as being some kind of bond. I've seen that suggested before. I have to say I don't find it personally very appealing, and I actually want to suggest another alternative to interpret the story. What are these arrows that God is referring to as he sends Rabbi Elazar back to, as he parts from Rabbi Elazar? Or again, to put it as I said before, what is the words of God that Rabbi Elazar hears in his mind, right, in his soul, as he's reemerges back into the world with this new understanding or newly articulated understanding of his relationship with God? And I want to just draw your attention to, again, the original and the preposition bach, girai bach, which here is translated, my arrows are upon you. And yes, that definitely works. It could be that that's what bach, the preposition, means, but it could also be translated differently. My arrows are within you. My arrows are within you, bicha, okay? They're in you. So what are these? Not I'm striking you with my arrows. You're not the victim of my arrows. You're the bearer, the carrier of my arrows. And as I send you back into the world, when you realize that what my role is and what my role is not, I'm reminding you or emphasizing to you that you are the bearer of my arrows. And what are these arrows? And I think there I just want to suggest, if we quickly look at, we have to begin to end because I'd like to also leave a couple of minutes for people's responses. In the Gemara Masechet Kiddushin, when it talks about the pasuk Vishinantem levanecha, okay, teaching one's children, teaching one's disciples, thou shalt teach them diligently. But the Hebrew verb Vishinantem also carries another layer of meaning to it, because shanun is sharp. That's why shinaim are shinaim, because they're sharp. And therefore the Midrash says, our rabbis taught, thou shalt teach them vishinantem, that the words of Torah should be sharp in your mouth, so that if anyone asks you something, you should not stammer and answer him, but rather you should answer him immediately. The Torah should be within you with such sharpness that you can answer. And then we have a string of psukim. For it is said, say unto wisdom, thou art my sister. And it's also said, bind them upon thy fingers, write them upon the table of thy heart. And it's also said, as arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are the children of thy youth. And it also says, sharp arrows of the mighty. And it also says, thy arrows are sharp. Okay, and thou shalt not misha, and again and again, psukim after psukim. But there's a bulk of psukim there at the end that seem to be talking about the words of Torah as arrows. And I think maybe inspired or perhaps by this section, this passage, that maybe the message of the story is Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat reemerges from this experience, this reevaluation of God's role, into his evaluation of his own role. He is the bearer of God's arrows, and he returns to this world with a whole different orientation. He's not waiting for his suffering to end. He's not waiting for God to answer his prayers for relief. He has a mission, and his mission is to be the arms bearer, the arrow bearer of God. And he's the Bal Horaot, and he becomes Mara de Arad Israel, as Rashi told us, right? And his whole orientation has changed in terms of who his God is and what his role is with reference to God. Okay, so I see we just really have a few minutes left, and we still have one last text that I'd like to end with, but I'd like to pause here and give people a couple of minutes. And I see there's been quite a bit on the chat, and I have to apologize for not being able to split my attention between both speaking and reading chats as they come in. Would anyone like to, at this point, respond? Thoughts, responses, ideas, reservations? Yep.
I was surprised because he didn't seem very humble. Like, the background was that he was this humble, or at least with his fellow man, he's a very humble person. I mean, I guess the fact that he alluded to prophets in that first extra source we looked at showed that he did have a sense of his own importance. But I was still a little surprised by his approach to God.
Yeah, I think he has the identification with prophets. I think he has a sense of his own role, right? And that he understands that he's in a religious leadership role. But he's constantly, I think it seems to me in that source was suggesting that he's constantly examining himself. Am I a false prophet? Am I a true prophet?
Right, but that's what didn't fit with this one, I thought.
So I think this intimacy, I agree with you. And that's why, I mean, the title I've given to this is this intimate conversation with God but is it really arrogant? It seems to me that it's very sincere, it's very genuine, it's very honest, but it doesn't come across to me, and it's a personal, I grant you for sure it's a personal read, but I don't hear arrogance here. I hear, almost innocence, when he says, what? Is that what I get? That's what one get. I mean, that's what's. So intonation is a big thing, and it's Torah Sheba'al Peh, obviously, and we're reading it from a dead text, so we can inject it with whatever intonation. I don't hear arrogance in this story. I certainly don't hear lack of humility. I hear a lot of innocence, almost naivete, and this all is happening, and I think the narrative suggests that is happening in the innermost, deepest thoughts of Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat. He is working out his God, what his God tells him. It's not the God, right? It's in that sense. It's not described as this revelation, as a bat kol, right? Coming from the heavens and making this public announcement. It's my personal conversation with God as I'm working out who I am, who he is, and what our relationship is. Okay, I know we want to respect people's time, but I see we have another few people with their hands up. Could we, quick responses, Esty and Catherine?
Okay.
First Esty, and then we'll move to Catherine. Okay.
Okay. The whole situation is amazing because who speaks directly with God? Only the Nevi'im, and Moses was the first kind of, including Moses was the one that had a rays of light from his forehead. This is one thing, this kind of very intimate, one-to-one, almost father-son. I mean, he speaks about as a son. And Rabbi Elazar speaks with him as a child would speak with his father. You know what I want? It's a negotiation, which again, you find only with the great leaders, with Abraham, with Moses, a negotiation. Yeah. That's one thing. Another thing, the association of arrows, it may be a cultural thing because we are speaking about Amoraim. So it's later, and there is a lot of influence of the Greek culture. And I'm thinking about Amor, the god of love that throws his arrows as an expression of love, a expression of love which is very naive and simplistic, versus here we see it as an expression of love and inheritance and spiritual inheritance, which is maybe taking the egg of the Amor story and making it something way more sophisticated and spirituul than just love.
Thank you. I love the wordplay. I don't know if you intended it on Amora and Amor, but it's fanciful. It's a midrash. Ken, thank you very much. Catherine.
Yeah, there's an ambiguity in the very beginning when he says that I was sitting with God. And one could potentially interpret that as, so are they sitting together as kind of a supplicant and a master? Because if that's the case, by the end, where Hashem says, my arrows are with you, that whole sitting together relationship has pivotably changed, and
Yeah.
it's two friends.
Yeah.
And what those arrows are God's presence.
Good. Yeah, I think and also just as a postscript to both of your comments, also the image of a parent with a child. Perhaps there's also a maturation process that's going on, a theologically maturing, shifting from one perhaps naive, innocent, almost childish image of God to a very different one, where God sends you off to be his, emissary and his, and there's, I think in that sense, it's a precious moment where someone invites us to hear his most innermost thoughts and shifts and changes. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I wish we had more time. I would like to end with source 7 in the Talmud in Masechet Brachot. There's a section where the Talmud shares personal prayers that various rabbis would add to their structured prayer. All right, the prayer, the Shacharit, Mincha, Mariv, whatever they're praying from, the constructed, formulated prayers, they add a personal prayer. And here's the Talmud, amongst others, also shares with us Rabbi Elazar's prayer. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat would add to his own prayer the following. I think we can end with it. It's a beautiful prayer. I haven't yet, but I'm still thinking about adding it as putting a copy of it in my own Siddur. But I think we hear echoes also of some of the things that we've been reading about him through the lines of his personal prayer that the Talmud tells us about. So we'll conclude with his prayer. Rabbi Elazar, Batar de Mesayem Tzlote, when he would conclude his prayers, he used to say the following: may it be thy will, O Lord our God, to cause to dwell in our lot. The original says purenu, pur, okay, which is of course the same word that produces Purim. It's that act of chance, of randomness, okay? And he says, may it be thy will, O Lord our God, to cause to dwell in our lot love and brotherhood and peace and friendship. And may thou make our borders rich in disciples and prosper our end with good prospect and hope, and set our portion in paradise. Remember the rivers of balsam oil? And grant us good companions and a good impulse in thy world. And may we rise early and find the yearning of our heart to be the fear of thy name. And may the satisfaction of our souls come before you for good. So with that note, if anyone wants to, I'm happy to stick around for another few minutes if people still have things that they wanted to share or ask or comment on. Other than that, I look forward to other opportunities to learn with all of you, whether in person in Jerusalem, preferably in person in Jerusalem, but Zoom is okay. Zoom works.
Thank you so much, Leah, for a wonderful shiur and for over 30 years of teaching at Pardes. This was really great. For those of you who have to hop off, thank you so much for coming. Our next and final class of the Legacy Learning series is on Tuesday, June 6th, featuring Rav Meir Schweiger on women and time-bound commandments. So it should be a juicy one. I also want to let everyone know before some people have to hop off that we have an exciting opportunity coming up for those of you who are based in the US or who are going to be in the US over the summer, which is an in-person Pardes alumni and friends retreat happening August 25th to 27th at the Pearlstone Retreat Center outside of Baltimore. I'll send details about it in a follow-up email after this class. But just wanted to put that out there. So thank you again for coming. If you have other questions and want to stick around, Leah, I think is available for another few minutes. And otherwise, have a great evening or rest of your day, depending on where you are.
Thank you, Jordan, for all the
Bekef.
Leah?
yes.
Hi,
Hi, Beverly.
how are you? It's so good to
Okay,
see
it's
you.
good to see you. Yes,
even-
there's
it's
so
even
many
good to hear
individual
you.
people that I want to say hello and how are you and how you been, and it's a forum. Yeah.
But, I loved hearing your voice, your animation and your voice.
Thank
Very
you.
evocative.
Thank you. It's good to
But I was
see
going to
you.
ask you a quick question about the chitzim, about the arrows. Why arrows?
Well, I think a lot of things that people have already said. Arrows are they have the sharpness. They also
Right.
have the ability to connect over a distance, right? You can, as opposed to other instruments, they can cover ground, they can pierce, they can
But they're
enter from the
painful.
outside in. Sorry?
They're painful.
They do involve pain, and I think that's part of what's happening here. Yes, but I think they, as I think Esty mentioned before, right? It's a universal symbol that somehow implies also that it pierces through from the outside inside, right? It manages to get through, and it's not always, it doesn't involve some kind of pain with it, but I think it's a very rich image. I'm not sure I don't think we've exhausted why, but it appears even within a Talmudic context, as I tried to demonstrate in that one passage from Kiddushin. So the image of the arrow as containing so much of that mixture.
It's so evocative. The whole Talmud, because he's struggling.
Yeah.
He's crying. He's laughing. He's fighting. He's accepting. He's challenging.
Yep.
Amazing. Just so personal.
Exactly. And I have to say that every time I come across Rabbi Elazar, it could be in the middle of some like halachic conversation that has nothing to do with any of his name. Like this story has significantly created a context for me to listen to his words in just ways that his, he's not just some anonymous interchangeable rabbinic figure. It could have been anybody. When Rabbi Elazar speaks in any given, discussion now, I carry that feeling, all those feelings with me from the story.
It's know him.
It's a bonding. I think it's a story that really creates
Yeah. Thank you for sharing it.
I see someone has their hand.
How are you doing? Otherwise, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Fine.
So
Yes, I hear
everybody.
Thank you. Daphna, do you have your hand up? I don't see an image.
Yes, I did. I think it's a very interesting story, and there are different aspects about it that are very interesting. And there's this one kind of small part at the beginning that also caught my attention, which is when Rabbi Elazar is talking to God kind of, about his suffering. God's offer is that he go back in time and that Rabbi Elazar could potentially be born at a more prosperous hour. And almost to say that, I've done some reading on the sages and astrology and their beliefs on that, not necessarily that some believe that, when we were born, the stars can impact destiny and this and that. But there does seem to be a belief that when we are born has impact either on our personality or our lives, that kind of made me wonder that it's here God is saying it's almost not that whatever suffering Rabbi Elazar is enduring has to do, it's not necessarily luck, or that it might just have to do with being born at a not prosperous hour.
Yes. Whether it's astrological, whether it's historical, sociological, economical. I mean, you were born, your circumstances, and that I think I alluded to it's one of the themes of Masechet Ta'anit, which obviously we don't have time to go into in any, depth, but that there are forces at work in the world that impact your story that I'm going to be here very, I think theologically cautious and say that God, choose not to interfere with. And so your destiny is not indirectly my doing, in contrast to that, my arrows are upon you, it's not, but I also have chosen for whatever reasons not to, to let that, and all I can do is toss the dice again. Maybe this time something will be different. But I think you're right. I think there's a lot of that subtext about what is it that determines what happens to people in this world, and what are the borders between God's intervention and the natural course of events. And that is very much on the mind of Masechet Ta'anit, very much so. I'm going to thank everybody again and again, invite you to find other opportunities to continue to learn. And I appreciate all of your thoughtfulness and your interest and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Leah. Take care.